Hut, 2, 3, 4. All over the world, the marching cadence of Uncle Sam's fighting men. This is a brief account of one unique group of them. Americans with Japanese faces and Japanese names. They're members of the Japanese-American combat team. Many of them volunteered to fight when they were behind the barbed wire enclosures of relocation centers, where they had been moved in 1942, soon after the outbreak of war. They volunteered to fight for the land of their birth, the adopted land of their parents. The Hawaiian boys gave the combat team a motto: go for broke.
I wanna go back to my little grass shack, back in Kalkiku, Hawaii. I wanna be with all the Connies and Wahinis that I knew long ago. I can hear the old guitar.
Aiko and I went to Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles and saw the exhibit on the Nisei soldiers of World War II. We got out of the museum, on the steps of the museum, I was telling Aiko, we want to find some way to let the public know what they did, is really important. Even at our old age, I felt we need to do something.
My mother was very passionate about really wanting to bring the story of the Nisei soldiers out to the broader audience, and she really did feel one way to do that was through this stamp that was sort of universal.
We started this campaign, stamp campaign. Aiko would write letters and I would write letters. It was strictly the grassroots. Everything was done by mail.
After all these years, my mother, Aiko, she spent so much time and was so, I'm gonna say, obsessed with the stamp campaign. Everywhere she went, she was looking to get people to sign petitions. And she carried it in her bag, whether we were at a restaurant or meeting somebody, just strangers.
Even if we didn't get the stamp, I thought the publicity of doing the campaign would help. And I think it really did. Chizo Hira, she joined us when we were getting kind of stagnant, and so she asked Wayne to help us with the stamp, and he became our coordinator. If it wasn't for him, I don't think we would have ever had a stamp issued.
I was so inspired, I said, I'm on board. What can I do? And we took their letters and we expanded them into a petition, and you'd be amazed at all the people that signed up.
When I got the news about the stamp from Wayne, I just couldn't believe it, because we waited for 15 years.
Now that this stamp is actually being issued, we're just really proud of my grandma and her fellow co-founders.
Yeah, just to think that the stamp's being issued after all those years of work, it makes me get emotional. Sometimes I can't talk. Yeah, it gives me chills. And she worked so hard at it, and it meant so much to her.
All of you Americans of Japanese descent have a right to be proud. You have demonstrated true Americanism on the field of battle. The 34th Division is proud of you. The 5th Army is proud of you. America is proud of you.
I didn't really realize how much the Nisei soldiers did until I started researching and reading more about the stories that they have out there about them.
My husband, he was in military intelligence service, and he was stationed in Japan, and he did counterintelligence work too.
When I found out that our dad was in the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, which was where they did the translation of a lot of the documents and what part they played in the war, that was a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah, I've heard that the war could have gone on for a few more years if it wasn't for the MIS and their help in breaking codes and interpreting and things like that.
Japanese American women also served in the MIS, as well as in the Women's Army Corps and as nurses. I was just really surprised on how quick the Niseis volunteered or were drafted into the service. Even being behind barbed wire, they viewed themselves as true Americans, and of course they're going to fight for their country.
One of the reasons about the stamp is that while I was in camp, several of my classmates' brothers were killed in action.
Some people tell me they put us in there for our protection, with the barbed wires and with the guard posts.
while your family's basically being imprisoned, that you would go fight for the country. That is pretty amazing, to be so patriotic.
When the call came for volunteers for a combat team, I volunteered from a relocation center to show my loyalty and to prove that I had the right to live as a good American citizen.
Throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States.
Freedom is something you really have to go through losing it before you appreciate it. In spite of them being in camp, they gave it their best. And I thought if the people learned that, I thought it would help people understand that you can't judge a person by their looks and everything. You have to judge a person individually.
The Nisei soldiers really opened up a lot of doors to us as Japanese Americans that never would have been possible without them proving their loyalty and kind of fighting for the things that they believed in. It would have been completely different. And I know that it's because my grandma and grandpa worked so hard, and all the Niseis did. They had to.
The Nisei legacy to me is just strong will. They really came out of camps with nothing. So many of them came out okay. They were able to raise their families and get college educations, get jobs, and just start their lives all over again.
To me, in my eyes, they were the true Americans. They fought for their country, they were strong, they came out of that war. They didn't complain and feel sorry for themselves, but they continued to just really move forward. We should all be very proud of our Japanese American heritage.
You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won.
Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it had so ill-treated. For their numbers and length of service, the Japanese Americans of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, including the 100th Infantry Battalion, became the most decorated unit in American military history. Americans of Asian descent did much more than prove they were Americans. They made our nation more American.
I just hope people are open to hearing the stories of the Japanese American soldiers. And I just hope it helps amplify just Asian voices in general, especially right now with so much prejudice happening.
I hope this stamp would lessen the discrimination against the Asians.
For this stamp to come out at this point in time, I hope it makes people a little more aware of contributions that Asians have done.
For me, I think the image of the Nisei soldier on the stamp will hopefully remind people that we're all Americans.
It is long past time to break the silence about their courage, to put faces and names with the courage, and to honor it.
On behalf of the National Japanese American Historical Society, whose founders were Go for Broke, I'd like to welcome you to today's Bay Area Go for Broke Forever Stamp Tribute. Against the backdrop of the Golden Gate Bridge, Bay Area salutes the U.S. Postal Service's issue of the Nisei Soldier postage stamp. For us, it symbolizes our nation's recognition of the dedicated service of our Nisei veterans of the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service. It is befitting as we emerge from this pandemic, that we take this time to remember and honor our veterans who are no longer with us, particularly those who never came home to their families. Their legacy helps guide us as we fight for equality and justice and hope for a safer and saner world.
The San Francisco Japanese American Citizens League and the National Japanese American Historical Society is sponsoring this video, honoring Nisei men and women who serve in our military. We would like to express our thanks for the 3 widows in California who spearheaded the Go for Broke stamp program to honor the memory of their loved ones who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our country. The San Francisco JCL believes that the story of the Nisei soldiers should never be forgotten. Most of the soldiers who fought in the war were in their early 20s. Over 30,000 Japanese American soldiers served during our war. One of the achievements of the Nisei soldiers was saving 211 Texas members of the Lost Battalion. My cousin told me a story. He was a veterinarian, and he had a client that came in one day and asked the question whether his dad was a member of the 442. And my cousin wondered why. The man said he was a survivor of those Lost Battalion. And then my cousins realized then that his dad was a war hero. Please join us for a moment of silence in honor of the Nisei soldiers.
The Nisei soldiers who fought World War II enemies abroad were seen as enemies back home, and many of them volunteered to serve their country while their families remained in American concentration camps. The United States tried to ban them from military service, but these Japanese American veterans ultimately became some of the most decorated soldiers in history.
The 442 Infantry Regiment is best known for its history as a fighting unit composed almost entirely of Nisei, who fought in World War II. More than 14,000 Nisei volunteers answered the call to serve America. The 442 Infantry Regiment fought primarily in the European theater, Italy, southern France, and Germany. 4,000 Purple Hearts, 560 Silver Star medals, 21 Medals of Honor, and 7 Presidential Unit citations. The unit's motto was "Go for Broke."
The 100th Infantry Battalion was the first combat unit, was comprised mostly of Nisei from Hawaii, many members of the Hawaii National Guard. Originally, the Hawaiian Provisional Infantry Battalion was shipped out of the islands. The unit was renamed the 100th Infantry Battalion and were deployed to combat in the 34th Red Bull Division to fight valiantly in Italy. Their heroic fight earned them the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion. This vanguard fighting force was joined by the 442 Regimental Combat Team to become the 100 442. Their battle-tested strength pierced the enemy strongholds of the Gothic lines, saved their Texan comrades, and liberated towns in Europe.
The 100th Infantry Battalion were primarily Nisei, former members of the Hawaii Army National Guard. They were from working-class families, young soldiers who performed extraordinary feats, fighting for their country, unwavering while facing racism and loss. Their stories are the stories of America. My uncle Kenneth Higa served in the 100th Battalion. He was inducted into the service when he was only 23 in 1941. He formed deep bonds with his fellow soldiers that lasted for the rest of his life. The 100th Battalion was a second family. It wasn't until 2011, when he was 95, that the 100th Battalion was recognized with a Congressional Gold Medal.
We are proud to present the Go for Broke Japanese American Soldiers of World War II, Forever Stand. This meritorious stamp is available now at post offices nationwide, or you can visit USPS.com.